Hi, my name is Clara, and I'm so excited to share my story with you. A few months ago, I decided to move to the United States to work as an au pair. Just like you, I was nervous about speaking English, but I knew that this would be an amazing opportunity to learn. Today, you're going to learn English with me through my very own experience. I'm going to take you along as I start my adventure with a new family, and we'll learn useful words and phrases together. So, don't forget to turn on the subtitles and repeat the phrases with me to improve your pronunciation. Let's get started. Clara stepped off the plane, feeling the buzz of excitement and nerves mix inside her. She had never been to the United States before, and now she was about to start her new life as an au pair in a family she had never met. Holding her small dictionary tightly in her hand, she walked through the airport, glancing at the signs and trying to catch a few words in English. "Okay, Clara, you can do this," she whispered to herself, repeating the simple phrase in her mind as she tried to calm her racing heart. As she exited the airport, she saw a woman holding a sign that read "Welcome, Clara." It was Mrs. Miller, the mother of the family she was going to live with. Clara smiled nervously and approached her. "Hi, I'm Clara," she said, holding out her hand. Mrs. Miller smiled warmly and shook Clara's hand. "Welcome to our family. It's so nice to meet you." Clara nodded, trying to remember the English words for the different things she was seeing. Mrs. Miller led her to the car, and they started the drive to the house. The city was bustling, but Clara's attention was drawn to everything around her, from the big buildings to the fast cars. When they arrived at the house, Clara was impressed. It was a beautiful two-story home with a lovely garden. Mrs. Miller introduced her to the rest of the family. There was Mr. Miller, a kind-looking man in his mid-40s, and their two children, Emily, a 6-year-old girl, and Tim, a 4-year-old boy. "Hi, Clara," Emily said excitedly, waving her hand. Tim followed suit, shyly saying, "Hi," in his small voice. Clara smiled back and tried to say, "Hello, how are you?" But the words came out a bit awkwardly. Mrs. Miller noticed and smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, Clara. You'll get the hang of it." They showed Clara to her room, where she unpacked her things. Everything felt so new and unfamiliar. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to take things one step at a time. "I'm here to learn, and I will," she thought, repeating her mantra. Later that afternoon, Clara was in the garden, trying to get used to the idea of being so far from home. When Mrs. Miller called her in to help prepare dinner, Clara felt a bit nervous. She knew that food was an important part of daily life, and she wanted to do her best. "Clara, can you help me with the salad and rice?" Mrs. Miller asked, while arranging some ingredients on the kitchen counter. Clara smiled and nodded, even though she wasn't 100% sure how to do everything. "Yes, I can help," she replied, trying to focus on the English words. She approached the counter and started looking at the ingredients. Mrs. Miller grabbed a head of lettuce and began cutting it into pieces. "This is lettuce. You need to cut it like this," she explained, carefully holding the knife. Clara watched closely and tried to imitate the movements. Lettuce, cut. As Clara started cutting the lettuce, Emily walked into the kitchen with her brother Tim, who seemed very excited. "Mum, can I help too?" Emily asked. "Of course, Emily. You can help by setting the table," Mrs. Miller replied, smiling. "Can you say 'set the table'?" she asked Clara, who repeated, "Set the table." Tim, curious, pointed to the onions on the counter. "What's this?" he asked with a confused look. Clara looked to Mrs. Miller, who quickly responded, "That's onion, Tim. Onion is a vegetable." "Clara, can you repeat?" Clara smiled, grateful for the chance to learn a new word. "Onion," Vegetable, she repeated, smiling at Tim. By the time the rice was almost ready, Mrs. Miller explained how to prepare it. You just put the rice in the pot with water and wait until it's ready, she said. Clara followed the instructions, watching closely as the process unfolded. With each new step, she tried to repeat the words she heard, like rice, water, pot, and ready. Dinner is almost ready, Mrs. Miller announced, as the smell of rice and salad filled the kitchen. Clara looked at the kids, who were excited to sit down at the table. Can I help with the plates? Clara asked, trying to be more involved in the meal preparation. Yes, please, Emily replied, smiling. Clara sat down at the table with the Miller family. She was happy to have been able to help with dinner, even if there had been some difficulties. But the most important thing was that she was starting to feel more connected to this new life. Thank you, Clara, Mrs. Miller said, looking at her with warmth. You did a great job today. Tomorrow, we can cook something new together. Clara smiled, feeling a little more at ease. I'm happy to help, she replied, even though her English was still far from perfect. The next day, Clara woke up feeling more comfortable in her new home. It was a bit easier now to understand what was happening around her. She had learned a few new words and phrases, and every day seemed like an opportunity to learn more. After breakfast, Mrs. Miller asked Clara if she wanted to go to the park with Emily and Tim. We're going to the park to play. Would you like to join us? She asked with a warm smile. Clara was excited about the idea of going outside, but she wasn't sure how much she would understand at the park. Yes, I'd like to go, she said, trying to sound confident. At the park, Emily and Tim ran ahead, laughing and playing on the swings. Clara walked behind them, taking in the fresh air and the sounds of children playing. She felt a little out of place, but she was determined to enjoy the moment. As they approached the swings, Emily turned around and asked, Clara, do you want to push me on the swing? She smiled brightly, waiting for Clara's answer. Clara hesitated for a moment. She had never pushed anyone on a swing before, but she smiled and said, Yes, I can push you. Emily climbed onto the swing, and Clara gently pushed her, watching as Emily's smile grew wider with every swing. Higher, Clara. Push me higher, Emily shouted, laughing. Clara laughed too, feeling a little more comfortable as she pushed Emily higher and higher. Higher? Okay, like this? Clara asked, pushing just a little harder. Yes, that's perfect, Emily cheered. After a few minutes, Emily jumped off the swing and ran to the sandbox. Clara, come play with me, she called. I'm building a castle. Clara walked over and smiled. A castle? She asked, looking at the sand mound Emily had started. Yes. You can help me, Emily said excitedly. She handed Clara a small shovel and said, You can dig. We need more sand. Clara took the shovel and began digging. As she worked alongside Emily, she realized how much she was learning just by being around the family. Emily kept talking to her, pointing at things and saying the words in English, and Clara repeated them over and over. Look, Clara, we made a castle, Emily said proudly, showing Clara the sandcastle they had built together. Clara smiled and nodded, feeling proud of her work. Good job, Emily, she said, even though she was still learning the language. As they finished their play, Mrs. Miller called out, It's time to go home, kids. Emily and Tim ran to the car, laughing and talking excitedly. Clara followed, feeling more confident than she had the day before. On the way home, Mrs. Miller looked at Clara and said, I'm really proud of you, Clara. You're learning so much already, and you're doing great. Clara smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. She was starting to feel like she truly belonged here. The days passed quickly, and Clara began to feel more at home in the Miller household. She had made progress with her English, and she felt more comfortable using the language in everyday situations. But there was one thing she still hadn't done: have a full conversation in English. One evening, after dinner, Mrs. Miller and Clara were cleaning up the kitchen together. The kids were playing in the living room, and the house was quiet, except for the sound of the dishes being washed. Clara carefully dried a plate, trying to think of something to say. She didn't want to just stay silent. She wanted to speak more English. But sometimes it felt hard to find the right words. "Clara, are you okay?" Mrs. Miller asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "You look a little quiet tonight." Clara smiled nervously and said, "I'm thinking. I want to speak more English, but I'm not sure how." Mrs. Miller nodded, understanding. "It's okay, Clara. You're doing great. But you have to practice speaking more, even if it's hard. How about we talk for a few minutes? We can start with something simple." Clara's heart raced a little. She wasn't sure if she was ready for a full conversation, but she knew this was a good opportunity to try. "Okay," Clara said, taking a deep breath. "I'll try." Mrs. Miller smiled warmly. "Great. Let's start with something easy. What did you do today?" Clara thought for a moment, trying to remember the right words. "Today, I helped Emily with her homework," she said slowly. "We read a book together." Mrs. Miller smiled. "That's wonderful, Clara. What was the book about?" Clara hesitated for a moment. "It was about a dog," she said, feeling proud that she could remember the word for the book. "A dog that goes to the park." "That sounds like a fun story," Mrs. Miller said, nodding. "Do you like reading in English?" Clara thought for a moment before answering. "Yes, I like it. But it's hard sometimes," she admitted. "The words are difficult." Mrs. Miller gave her a reassuring smile. "That's completely normal. The more you practice, the easier it will get. And remember, it's okay to make mistakes. The most important thing is that you're trying." Clara felt a little better. Mrs. Miller's encouragement meant a lot to her. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. Mrs. Miller nodded. "You're welcome, Clara. We're all learning in our own way. Now, let's finish up here, and then we can relax and watch a movie together." Clara felt a sense of relief. Even though the conversation was simple, it was a huge step for her. She had spoken in English, and she had understood most of what Mrs. Miller said. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As they finished cleaning the kitchen, Clara felt proud of herself. She had started her first conversation in English, and that was something to celebrate. The next morning, Clara woke up feeling excited. It wasn't just because of the beautiful day ahead. It was also because Mrs. Miller had told her that a neighbor's daughter, Lily, was coming over to visit. Clara had been looking forward to meeting new people, and she was eager to make a new friend. After breakfast, Mrs. Miller mentioned that Lily would arrive soon. Clara felt a bit nervous. She was still learning English, and the thought of talking to a new person made her anxious. What if she couldn't understand her? What if she said something wrong? When the doorbell rang, Emily and Tim rushed to open it. "Hi, Lily," they shouted in unison, and Clara followed them to the door. Lily was about the same age as Emily, with bright red hair and a friendly smile. She waved at Clara and said, "Hi, I'm Lily." Clara smiled shyly and said, "Hi, I'm Clara." Lily's smile grew wider. "Nice to meet you, Clara. Do you want to play with us?" she asked, looking at Emily and Tim. Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I'd like to play," she replied, trying her best to sound confident. She wasn't sure what they were going to do, but she wanted to try. They all went to the backyard, where Emily and Lily started to play with a soccer ball. Clara watched them for a moment, unsure of how to join in. She didn't know how to play soccer very well, and she didn't want to make a mistake. Lily noticed that Clara was standing back. "Do you want to try kicking the ball?" she asked kindly. Clara smiled, feeling a little better. "I can try," she said, walking toward the ball. "Here, I'll show you," Lily said, demonstrating how to kick the ball gently. "Like this." Clara watched closely and then kicked the ball, feeling proud when it rolled a little bit across the grass. "I did it," she said, smiling. "Great job, Clara," Lily cheered. "You kicked it really far." Clara laughed, feeling happy. "Thank you," she said, still a bit shy but feeling more comfortable. As they played, Lily spoke to Clara in simple English, pointing at things and explaining them. "That's a tree," she said, pointing to a large oak tree in the yard. "This is a soccer ball. We kick it like this." Clara repeated the words and tried to remember them. Tree, soccer ball, kick. "Exactly," Lily said, nodding. "You're doing really well, Clara." The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. Clara felt more relaxed as she spent time with Emily, Tim, and Lily. She didn't understand everything Lily said, but she felt like she was getting better at picking up words and phrases. The more they played and talked, the more confident Clara became. As the sun began to set, Lily said, "I have to go home now. But it was really fun playing with you, Clara." Clara smiled warmly. "I had fun too. Thank you for playing with me." Lily waved goodbye and walked back to her house, leaving Clara with a feeling of happiness and accomplishment. She had made a new friend, and although the conversation wasn't perfect, it felt like a big step forward. Clara went inside and told Mrs. Miller about her afternoon. "I made a new friend today," Clara said, her voice full of excitement. Mrs. Miller smiled and said, "I'm so proud of you, Clara. You're doing great with your English, and now you have a new friend to practice with." Clara felt a warm sense of pride. She had taken another step toward making this new country feel like home. The following week was full of small victories for Clara. Every day, she learned something new, and every conversation, no matter how small, made her feel a little more confident. One afternoon, Clara was in the living room, reading a book Emily had lent her. It was a simple story about a dog that went on an adventure, and Clara found it both fun and helpful for her learning. As she read, she started recognizing more words she had heard before. "Look, I know this word," Clara said out loud, pointing at the page. "Adventure. I remember when Emily told me about an adventure." Mrs. Miller, who was sitting nearby, smiled. "You're doing great, Clara, see? Every time you read, you're building your vocabulary." Clara nodded, feeling encouraged. "It's getting easier," she said quietly. "I can understand a little more." At that moment, Tim walked in, holding a toy car. "Clara, can we play cars? I can teach you English words while we play," he said, holding up the little car to her. Clara looked at him, feeling excited. "Yes, let's play," she said, ready to take advantage of every opportunity to practice. They began playing with the toy cars on the floor. Tim pushed a car toward Clara and said, "This is the car. The car goes fast." He pushed the car and smiled at her. "Now, you try." Clara smiled back, picking up the car. "Car, fast," she repeated, trying to imitate Tim's enthusiasm. She pushed the car across the floor, laughing when it made a little noise. "Good job, Clara. Now, say slow down," Tim instructed, pushing his car slowly across the floor. Clara followed, pushing her car gently. "Slow down," she repeated, feeling proud. Mrs. Miller, who was watching from the kitchen, joined in with a smile. "You two are doing a great job. Clara, you're really improving your speaking. Clara's face lit up. Thank you, she said, smiling. She had never felt so encouraged before. The simple activities, like playing with Tim and reading a book, were helping her feel more comfortable using her new language. Later that evening, after dinner, Mrs. Miller suggested that Clara help her organize the garage. Clara, can you help me sort these boxes? You'll learn a lot of new words. Clara agreed, ready to keep practicing. As they worked together, Mrs. Miller explained things. This is a box. This is a shelf. They're putting the boxes on the shelf. Box. Shelf, Clara repeated, carefully placing a box on the shelf. They worked side by side, and each time Mrs. Miller said a new word, Clara repeated it. By the end of the evening, Clara had learned words like shelf, drawer, and bin. As they finished up, Clara looked around and realized just how much she had learned. I know more words now. It feels good, she said, smiling at Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller nodded. You've come a long way, Clara. You're doing amazing, and I can see the progress every day. Clara smiled, feeling proud of herself. She had started to feel like she was no longer just learning English, but living it. When she went to bed that night, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It hadn't been easy, but every little step had brought her closer to feeling at home in this new world. She couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The following weekend, Mrs. Miller asked Clara if she wanted to go shopping. We need to pick up a few things for the house, she explained. Would you like to come with me? It's a great opportunity to practice more English. Clara eagerly agreed. She had been to the store before, but this time, she was excited because it would be a chance to use more English in a real-life setting. She had learned many words at home, but she knew that speaking English outside of the house would be a new challenge. When they arrived at the store, Mrs. Miller handed Clara a shopping list. Can you help me find these things? She asked. Clara looked at the list, which had simple items like bread, milk, and eggs. She recognized all the words, but she wasn't sure how to ask for them in English. As they walked through the aisles, Mrs. Miller pointed to different items and said their names. This is bread. This is milk, she explained. Clara repeated the words, bread, milk, trying to remember them. She felt more confident than before, but she knew there was still a lot to learn. When they reached the fruit section, Mrs. Miller asked, Clara, can you find the apples? Clara looked around, trying to spot the apples. Apples. Ah, here, she said, pointing to a pile of red apples. Mrs. Miller smiled. Good job, Clara. Now, can you find the bananas? Clara looked around again, this time more quickly. She spotted the bananas right away. Bananas, she said, feeling proud of herself. They continued walking through the store, and Clara helped Mrs. Miller find other items on the list. Each time she found something, she felt more confident using the words. As they approached the checkout, Clara saw a man standing in line ahead of them. He smiled at her and said, Hi, how are you? Clara froze for a moment. She knew how to answer, but speaking to a stranger felt different. She took a deep breath and remembered what Mrs. Miller had told her. It was okay to make mistakes. I'm good, thank you, Clara said, trying her best to sound confident. The man smiled and said, That's great. I'm glad you're doing well. Clara felt a sense of relief wash over her. The conversation was simple, but it was a huge step for her. She had spoken to a stranger, and she had understood the conversation. As they paid for the groceries and left the store, Mrs. Miller turned to Clara. You did amazing today. I'm really proud of you. Clara smiled, feeling happy and accomplished. Thank you, she said, feeling more confident than ever. I think I'm getting better at this, Mrs. Miller laughed. You definitely are, Clara. Keep practicing, and you'll be speaking English like a pro in no time. Clara felt a warmth in her heart. She knew she still had a long way to go, but with each conversation, each new word, she was getting closer to her goal. As the weeks passed, Clara's confidence continued to grow. She was no longer afraid to speak English, and she had become more comfortable in everyday situations. But one morning, Mrs. Miller mentioned something that made Clara's heart race a little. Clara, Mrs. Miller said, I received an invitation for you. It's from the local community center. They're having an English conversation group, and they asked if you'd like to join. Clara felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She knew this was a great opportunity to practice more English, but the thought of speaking with a group of people was a little intimidating. I'm not sure, Clara said hesitantly. What if I make a lot of mistakes? Mrs. Miller smiled and reassured her. Everyone makes mistakes, Clara. The important thing is that you try. And it's a great way to meet other people and practice in a comfortable setting. Clara thought for a moment. She had come so far, and this could be a big step forward. Okay, she said finally. I'll do it. The following evening, Clara and Mrs. Miller went to the community center. It was a cozy room with a circle of chairs. There were a few people already there, all of them smiling and talking in English. As Clara walked in, one of the volunteers, a woman named Sarah, came over to greet them. Hi, Clara, it's so nice to meet you. We're happy you could join us. Clara smiled nervously. Hi, I'm Clara. Thank you for having me. Sarah nodded. No problem. We're all here to learn and practice together. Don't worry about making mistakes. Just relax and enjoy the conversation. Clara sat down in one of the chairs, feeling a bit out of place at first. The group was small, with about 5 people, all of them at different levels of English. They started by introducing themselves, and Clara listened closely as each person spoke. When it was her turn, Clara felt her hands shake a little. Hello, my name is Clara, she said, her voice slightly nervous. I'm from Brazil. I've been learning English for a few months. The group smiled and nodded, and Sarah encouraged her. Great job, Clara. That's exactly how we all started. Now, let's talk about our favorite things. What do you like to do in your free time? Clara thought for a moment. I like to read books, she said. And I like to play with my friends. The group asked her a few more questions, and Clara did her best to answer. She made some mistakes, but everyone was very patient and encouraging. It felt a little challenging, but also exciting. After a while, Clara began to feel more comfortable. She was surprised at how much she could understand and respond to. Everyone in the group was learning at their own pace, and Clara realized that she wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one who made mistakes, and she wasn't the only one who had to think carefully about what to say. At the end of the session, Sarah said, You all did a fantastic job today. Clara, you're really improving, and you should be proud of yourself. Clara smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Thank you, she said. I think I can do this. As she and Mrs. Miller walked home that evening, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the conversation group. It had been difficult, but also incredibly rewarding. She had faced her fear of speaking in a group, and she had made it through. I'm glad I went, Clara said, looking up at Mrs. Miller. It was hard, but I'm happy I tried. Mrs. Miller smiled warmly. I'm proud of you, Clara. You took a big step, and I know you'll keep getting better. Clara nodded, feeling more confident than ever. She knew that challenges were a part of learning, and this was just one more challenge she had conquered. As the months went by, Clara's English continued to improve, and her daily life started to feel more natural. She no longer worried about making mistakes. Instead, she focused on enjoying the experience of learning. Every conversation, whether with Mrs. Miller, Emily, Tim, or someone new, was another opportunity to practice, and she was always eager to learn more. One afternoon, Clara received a letter from her school. It was an invitation to participate in the school's talent show. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it. Clara had always loved to sing, and although she hadn't performed in front of a crowd before, this was something she really wanted to try. But there was one catch: she would have to sing in English. Should I do it? Clara asked Mrs. Miller later that evening, holding up the letter. I really want to, but I'm nervous about singing in English. Mrs. Miller looked at her thoughtfully. Clara, I think this is a great opportunity. It'll be challenging, but that's how we grow. You've made so much progress already, and this will help you even more. Plus, you've always loved singing. Don't let fear stop you. Clara hesitated, but she knew Mrs. Miller was right. Singing in front of an audience was a big step, but it was also a chance to push herself. Okay, Clara said, determination in her voice. I'll do it. Over the next few weeks, Clara worked hard on her song. She chose a simple but beautiful song in English, something she had heard many times before and loved. Mrs. Miller helped Clara with pronunciation and gave her advice on how to practice. Emily and Tim even helped Clara with the lyrics, repeating the words together until Clara felt more confident. The night of the talent show arrived, and Clara felt a mix of excitement and nerves. As she stood backstage, waiting for her turn, she could hear the other students performing. Some were singing, some were dancing, and some were telling jokes. Clara took a deep breath and tried to calm her nerves. Clara, you've got this, Mrs. Miller said, giving her a reassuring smile. Remember, just enjoy it. You've worked so hard. When Clara's name was called, she walked onto the stage, her heart racing. The audience clapped and smiled at her, and she felt a sense of warmth wash over her. She took the microphone, and with one last deep breath, she started to sing. Her voice was steady, and she sang the words clearly. Clara wasn't perfect, but she felt confident. She wasn't worried about mistakes. She was just focused on the music and the joy it brought her. With each note, Clara felt more at ease. The audience listened quietly, and when she finished the song, they cheered and clapped. Clara smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had faced her fear of performing in English, and she had made it through. As she walked off the stage, Mrs. Miller gave her a big hug. I'm so proud of you, Clara. You were amazing. Clara felt a rush of pride. Thank you, she said, her heart full. I'm glad I did it. The next day at school, Clara received even more compliments from her classmates. You did so great last night, one of them said. I can't believe how good your English is. Clara felt proud, but more than that, she felt grateful for everything she had learned. The talent show had been a challenge, but it had also shown her just how far she had come. Each step, no matter how small, had helped her grow. That evening, Clara sat down with Mrs. Miller to talk about everything that had happened. I can't believe I did it, Clara said. I really pushed myself and it feels amazing. Mrs. Miller smiled, her eyes full of pride. You've come so far, Clara, and you'll continue to grow. You're stronger than you think. Clara looked out the window, feeling more hopeful than ever. She had learned so much in the past months, and she knew there was still more to come. The journey wasn't over, but she was excited to see where it would take her. As the school year drew to a close, Clara felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced before. She had come so far in her English learning journey, and each day she felt more confident and capable. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when she felt unsure of herself, but she had learned to embrace those moments as part of the process. One morning, Clara walked into class, and her teacher, Mrs. Johnson, called her up to the front of the room. "Clara, I wanted to let you know that we've been following your progress, and we're really impressed with how much you've learned. We think you're ready to take the next step." Clara's heart raced. She had been studying hard and trying her best, but she hadn't expected such a compliment. "Next step?" Clara asked, curious. Mrs. Johnson smiled. "Yes, we believe you're ready to start participating in advanced conversation practice with the other students. We'll be starting a more challenging class soon, and we'd love for you to join." Clara's face lit up. It was both exciting and a little nerve-wracking, but she knew it was the perfect opportunity to continue growing. "I'd love to, thank you," she said, feeling both proud and a little bit scared. But the fear was different now. It wasn't the same paralyzing fear she had once felt about speaking English. It was the kind of nervousness that comes with something new and exciting. Later that day, Mrs. Miller asked Clara how school had gone. "You look happy," she said with a smile. Clara couldn't contain her excitement. "I'm ready for the next level, Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Johnson says I can join the advanced conversation class." Mrs. Miller's eyes shone with pride. "That's amazing, Clara. I knew you could do it. Look at how far you've come." Over the next few weeks, Clara attended her new class. It was more challenging, but she was ready. The other students were friendly, and they worked together to help each other learn. Clara was still nervous at times, especially when they had to speak in front of the group. But she noticed that each time she spoke, it got a little easier. The more she practiced, the more confident she became. One afternoon, while Clara was at the grocery store with Mrs. Miller, something happened that made her realize just how far she had come. They were in the cereal aisle when a store employee approached them. "Excuse me," the employee said. "Could you help me find the sugar-free cereal? I'm not sure where it is." Clara looked at Mrs. Miller, who nodded. Clara stepped forward and, without hesitation, said to the employee, "I think it's on the next aisle. Let me show you." Mrs. Miller smiled as Clara led the employee to the correct aisle. When they got there, the employee thanked Clara. "You're very kind. Thank you for your help." Clara smiled back. "You're welcome," she said, feeling proud of herself. She realized that in that moment, speaking in English didn't feel scary at all. It felt natural. As they continued shopping, Mrs. Miller turned to Clara. "You did great. Just think 6 months ago, you would have never been able to do that." Clara nodded, a huge smile on her face. "I know," she said, amazed at how far she had come. "I'm so proud of myself." Later that evening, as Clara sat in her room, she reflected on everything she had achieved. She had faced many challenges along the way, but each one had helped her grow. She had learned to speak English, not just in the classroom, but in real-life situations. She had made mistakes, but she had learned from them. And most importantly, she had learned to believe in herself. Clara knew that the journey was far from over. She would continue learning, continue growing, and continue facing new challenges. But one thing was certain. She was no longer the same person she had been when she first arrived. She was stronger, more confident, and ready to take on whatever came next. As the summer approached, Clara found herself reflecting on everything she had accomplished over the past year. Her English had improved beyond what she had ever imagined, and each day she felt more at home in her new life. From her first conversation at the store to singing in the talent show, and now to participating in advanced classes, Clara had grown in ways she never thought possible. One evening, after finishing her homework, Clara sat down with Mrs. Miller to discuss her plans for the summer. "What are your goals for the next few months?" Mrs. Miller asked. Clara smiled, thinking about the opportunities ahead. I want to keep practicing English. Maybe I can start reading books in English. And I'd love to watch more movies without subtitles. Mrs. Miller nodded. That's a great idea. And you could also try speaking more with people outside of school. Maybe you can volunteer somewhere and practice your English in real-life situations. Clara's eyes lit up. I like that idea. I could help others and keep learning at the same time. Over the next few weeks, Clara took every opportunity to practice her English. She read simple books in English, watched movies with the sound on and subtitles off, and even volunteered at a local community center where she helped with children's activities. Each day, she was building her confidence and refining her skills. One afternoon, while she was volunteering, a woman named Rachel came up to Clara. Hi, I'm Rachel. I heard you're learning English. That's amazing. Clara smiled, feeling proud of how far she had come. Hi, yes, I'm learning. It's been a challenge, but I'm really enjoying it. Rachel nodded. That's wonderful. I actually teach English classes here for beginners. Would you be interested in helping me out sometimes? You could practice your skills while helping others. Clara felt a rush of excitement. I'd love to. I can help with the classes. Over the next few weeks, Clara started helping Rachel with her English classes. She assisted with activities and conversations, helping beginners practice the basics. Clara quickly realized how much she had learned, and it felt amazing to share that knowledge with others. The students in Rachel's class were just beginning their English journeys, and Clara knew exactly what they were going through. One day after a class, Rachel pulled Clara aside. You've been doing a great job, Clara. You're not just helping the students. You're also helping yourself. You've really grown in your ability to speak and understand English. Clara beamed. Thank you, Rachel. I've learned so much and it feels great to help others. That summer, Clara became more involved in her community. She spoke more English than ever before, not just in class, but in everyday situations. Whether it was helping a neighbor with directions or talking to a customer at a store, Clara used every opportunity to practice and improve. As the summer came to an end, Clara reflected on how much she had changed. She had learned so much, not just about English, but about herself. She was no longer afraid to speak up. She had learned that making mistakes was just part of the process, and each mistake was an opportunity to improve. On the first day of school, Mrs. Miller gave Clara a proud hug. I can't believe how much you've grown, Clara. You've come so far since we first started. Clara smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I've learned so much and I'm excited to keep learning. As the school year began again, Clara felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She knew that her journey with English was far from over, but she also knew that she had the skills, the confidence, and the determination to keep going. She was excited for the next chapter of her life, knowing that it would be filled with new opportunities to learn, grow, and speak confidently. As the summer approached, Clara found herself reflecting on everything she had accomplished over the past year. Her English had improved beyond what she had ever imagined, and each day she felt more at home in her new life. From her first conversation at the store to singing in the talent show, and now to participating in advanced classes, Clara had grown in ways she never thought possible. One evening, after finishing her homework, Clara sat down with Mrs. Miller to discuss her plans for the summer. What are your goals for the next few months? Mrs. Miller asked. Clara smiled, thinking about the opportunities ahead. I want to keep practicing English. Maybe I can start reading books in English, and I'd love to watch more movies without subtitles. Mrs. Miller nodded. That's a great idea. And you could also try speaking more with people outside of school. Maybe you can volunteer somewhere and practice your English in real-life situations. Clara's eyes lit up. I like that idea. I could help others and keep learning at the same time. Over the next few weeks, Clara took every opportunity to practice her English. She read simple books in English, watched movies with the sound on and subtitles off, and even volunteered at a local community center where she helped with children's activities. Each day, she was building her confidence and refining her skills. One afternoon, while she was volunteering, a woman named Rachel came up to Clara. "Hi, I'm Rachel. I heard you're learning English." "That's amazing." Clara smiled, feeling proud of how far she had come. "Hi, yes, I'm learning. It's been a challenge, but I'm really enjoying it." Rachel nodded. "That's wonderful. I actually teach English classes here for beginners. Would you be interested in helping me out sometimes? You could practice your skills while helping others." Clara felt a rush of excitement. "I'd love to. I can help with the classes." Over the next few weeks, Clara started helping Rachel with her English classes. She assisted with activities and conversations, helping beginners practice the basics. Clara quickly realized how much she had learned, and it felt amazing to share that knowledge with others. The students in Rachel's class were just beginning their English journeys, and Clara knew exactly what they were going through. One day after a class, Rachel pulled Clara aside. "You've been doing a great job, Clara. You're not just helping the students, you're also helping yourself. You've really grown in your ability to speak and understand English." Clara beamed. "Thank you, Rachel. I've learned so much and it feels great to help others." That summer, Clara became more involved in her community. She spoke more English than ever before, not just in class, but in everyday situations. Whether it was helping a neighbor with directions or talking to a customer at a store, Clara used every opportunity to practice and improve. As the summer came to an end, Clara reflected on how much she had changed. She had learned so much, not just about English, but about herself. She was no longer afraid to speak up. She had learned that making mistakes was just part of the process, and each mistake was an opportunity to improve. On the first day of school, Mrs. Miller gave Clara a proud hug. "I can't believe how much you've grown, Clara. You've come so far since we first started." Clara smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I've learned so much and I'm excited to keep learning." As the school year began again, Clara felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She knew that her journey with English was far from over, but she also knew that she had the skills, the confidence, and the determination to keep going. She was excited for the next chapter of her life, knowing that it would be filled with new opportunities to learn, grow, and speak confidently. Clara's journey wasn't just about learning English. It was about believing in herself, pushing through challenges, and embracing every opportunity for growth. From her first nervous steps to speaking confidently in front of a group, Clara learned that every small practice made a huge difference. Today, you learned alongside Clara how to navigate challenges, embrace mistakes, and continue improving your English step by step. Just like Clara, you can achieve great things, no matter how difficult it seems at first. Remember, each small effort counts. Whether it's practicing a new phrase, watching a movie in English, or talking to someone, it all adds up to progress. So, keep going, keep growing. Don't give up. Every time you practice, you're getting one step closer to fluency. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. There's a whole community of learners just like you, ready to grow together. If you enjoyed this story and learned something new, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next adventure. There's so much more to discover, and I'm excited to help you learn even more. See you next time, and keep practicing.